5 words. I accept your rejection. They were spoken softly, deliberately, and yet the whole froze. The Alpha King's eyes, sharp, unyielding, accustomed to obedience, widened in disbelief. Every noble, every warrior, every elder expected tears, pleas, or at least the shattering of a human heart. But Liora Ashwyn gave them none of that. She did not crumble. She did not beg. She did not falter. She only met his gaze with a calm so steady it unmoored him, shaking the Alpha King in ways no battle, no challenge, no rival ever had. And in that single, quiet moment, Rael Stormclaw, ruler of the pack, master of command, the Alpha King, felt the first fracture of a control he had never before lost. She walked away, untouched by shame, unclaimed. And unknowingly, she began a journey that would unravel the strongest king the realm had ever known. Chapter 1. The Rejection Before the Pack. The great hall of the Stormclaw Citadel was a cavern of stone, fur, and simmering power. Torchlight licked the ancient runes carved into the obsidian pillars, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to bow toward the dais. The air itself was thick, scented with pine, iron, and the dense, layered aromas of every dominant wolf in the realm, gathered for the choosing. At the center of it all, on a throne of antler and polished granite, sat Rael Stormclaw, Alpha King. His presence was a physical weight, a silent thunder that commanded the breath in every lung. His broad frame was draped in the black and silver of his station, a dark pelt across his shoulders. His storm-gray eyes swept the assembled pack alphas, betas, and elders, a cool, imperious mask of absolute control. This ceremony was not just tradition, it was a necessary display. Strength was not merely possessed. It had to be witnessed, reaffirmed, feared. Bring her forward. His voice, low and resonant, cut through the murmurs like a blade. The sea of bodies parted. And there she was. Liora Ashwyn. She walked with a stillness that was out of place in the primal energy of the hall. Her gown was simple, a slip of moon-gray silk against the vibrant furs and leathers around her. Her hair, the color of aged ashwood, fell in a straight cascade down her back. She was not flashy, not defiant. But her eyes, as she lifted them to the dais, they were the unsettling calm of a deep forest pool, steady, clear, and absorbing all light without reflection. The choosing ritual proceeded. The priestess of the moon invoked the old bonds. Liora was tested, her scent released into the hall, a subtle, complex fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and crisp winter rain. It was not overpowering. It was intricate. A scent one had to lean into to truly know. Rael felt a distant, involuntary pull in his gut, a primal string tuning itself. He ignored it. He had to. He watched her endure the ceremonial scrutiny, the physical inspection that proved her health and lineage. Her composure never fractured. She was a portrait of quiet acceptance, and for a reason he couldn't name, that stillness began to itch at him. Where were the nerves? The trembling hope? The appropriate awe? The moment arrived. The priestess stepped back, her part complete. All eyes fixed on the throne. This was the king's pronouncement. This was the performance. Rael rose. His height seemed to swallow the torchlight behind him. He looked down at Liora, not as a man to a woman, but as a king to a subject. As a force to a potential weakness. The bond of fate is a chain, he declared, his voice carrying to the farthest corners. It is a temptation to rely on predestination instead of our own will. True power is not found in accepting what the moon gives, but in mastering the self. In choosing discipline over desire. He let the words hang, feeling the approval ripple through the hall. This was the lesson they needed. The proof of his iron will. His gaze locked onto Liora's. Liora Ashwyn. The bond is recognized, and rejected. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Then, a hushed, eager silence descended. This was the peak of the drama. They waited for the collapse. For her to crumple at his feet, to weep, to beg. It was the natural order. The rejected one was meant to break, cementing the rejecter's supreme strength. Liora did not crumple. She didn't flinch. Her shoulders, if anything, settled into a more solid line. She held his gaze, and in the depths of her calm eyes, he saw no shock, no devastation. Only a profound, unsettling understanding. Then, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, yet it carried in the dead silence, clear and smooth as a stone dropped into a well. I accept your rejection. 5 words. Simple. Final. Utterly devoid of heat or ice. They landed not like a blow, but like a key turning in a lock deep inside him, a lock he hadn't known existed. The crack was silent but seismic. The flawless facade of his control, the narrative of strength he was so carefully orchestrating, developed a hairline fracture. She didn't wait for dismissal. She didn't look at the pitying or triumphant faces around her. With a grace that was neither hurried nor hesitant, she turned. The gray silk of her dress whispered against the stone floor. She walked back down the aisle she had come, her head held not in arrogance, but in a simple, unassailable dignity. The pack remained frozen, the script of the ceremony torn apart. They watched her go, this woman who carried her own dismissal like a neutral fact. Rael stood immobilized on the dais. The hall felt suddenly cold, the torches guttering. The scent of jasmine and winter rain, now touched with the faint, metallic tinge of his own shock, lingered where she had stood. He watched the empty space where she had vanished into the shadowed archway. A raw, jagged impulse roared to life in his chest, a command to stop her, to call her back, to undo the last 60 seconds. He clenched his jaw until the bone ached, his fingers curling into fists so tight his claws pricked his own palms. The pain was an anchor. He did not move. She was gone. And she had left untouched. Unbroken. And in the vast, silent hollow that her absence carved through the spectacle of his power, Rael Stormclaw felt the first, terrifying tremor of his own undoing. Chapter 2, The Walk That Haunts Him. The silence Liora left in her wake was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a held breath that slowly filled with the rustle of furs, the scrape of boots, and a low, confused murmur that rose like swamp gas. The ceremony was over, but its purpose, the king's display of indomitable will, had curdled into something strange and disquieting. Rael stood on the dais long after the last elder had bowed and shuffled out. The throne room, emptied of its crowd, felt cavernous and accusing. The torches hissed. His beaters, Kalin and Torin, lingered by the doors, exchanging a silent look he chose not to interpret. "See to the western patrols," Rael commanded, his voice rougher than he intended. It was a dismissal. They obeyed without a word, melting into the shadows. He was alone. He descended the dais steps, his boots echoing too loudly. He walked to the exact spot on the polished granite floor where she had stood. He inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring. It was still there. Jasmine. Winter rain. It wasn't the cloying, overwhelming perfume of a desperate omega. It was a scent that asked nothing. It simply was. And now, it was seared into the stone, into the air, into the fabric of his formal jacket. He stripped the jacket off, throwing it over the arm of his throne as if it were contaminated. The gesture was futile. The scent was inside him now, a ghost in his sinuses. Beyond the citadel walls, the pack was a hive of buzzing speculation. In the warrior's hall, over steaming haunches of venison, the talk was of bewildered admiration. Did you see her? No tears. Not even a flinch. She looked him right in the eye, grunted a grizzled sentinel, shaking his head. Cold as mountain stone. Or strong, countered a younger hunter, her eyes alight. Maybe she's the one with the real power. To walk away from that? Unbroken. In the communal kitchens and weaving rooms, the whispers were more pointed. He rejected the bond. Publicly. What does that mean for the bloodline? An elder matron muttered, her fingers knotting wool with anxious speed. It means he's stronger than fate, a loyalist hissed back. Or a fool, another voice, barely audible, ventured. That Ashwyn girl, her scent was different. Not weak. Deep. The rumors twisted and multiplied. She was a witch. She had planned it. She had another mate waiting. She had humiliated the king. She had freed herself. Each version chipped away at the clean, decisive narrative Rael had tried to create. High in the king's private chambers, the rumors were a distant hum against the fortress stone. Here, there was only the pounding silence of his own mind. Rael paced. The spacious room, with its pelts and maps and weapons, felt like a cage. He poured a goblet of strong, spiced wine, drank it in one burning gulp, and willed it to bring numbness. It didn't. It only made the memory sharper, more sensory. He could see the exact way the torchlight had caught the subtle highlights in her ash-brown hair. The precise, unblinking steadiness of her gaze. The elegant line of her throat as she spoke those 5 devastating words. The whisper of her gown on stone as she turned. "I accept your rejection." He growled, the sound rumbling in his chest. He should be feeling triumph. Relief. The savage satisfaction of supreme self-mastery. He had done what no alpha king in generations had dared, publicly denied the moon's choice to prove his will was supreme. His reign would be legendary for this act. So why did his blood feel like it was crackling with static? Why did the space between his shoulder blades itch with a phantom awareness? He threw himself onto the massive bed, its furs usually a comfort. Now they felt stifling. He closed his eyes, and she was there. Not in a dream, but in a relentless, waking replay. The scent from the throne room seemed to have followed him, woven into the very air of his chamber. He turned his face into his own pillow, and for a hallucinatory second, he swore he caught the faintest trace of winter jasmine. His body reacted before his mind could censure it. A surge of heat, a tightening in his gut, a low, primal ache that was equal parts longing and fury. His wolf, usually a silent, disciplined shadow within him, stirred for the first time in years, not with aggression, but with a raw, confused yearning. It was a physical pull, a compass needle spinning wildly, seeking a source that was no longer in the hall, no longer in the citadel, no longer his. No. He sat bolt upright, chest heaving. This was nothing. Residual energy from the ritual. The shock of her unconventional response. It was irritation, not obsession. She was a problem solved, a temptation removed. Her calm was a trick, a defense mechanism of a weak spirit. He told himself these things. He repeated them like a mantra, carving the words into the stone of his resolve. But his body, traitorous and wired with a deeper, older logic, disagreed. It hummed with a newfound emptiness. It trembled with a denied connection. It remembered the scent, the stillness, the unbroken grace of her exit, and it recognized, with a certainty that bypassed his royal intellect, a catastrophic error. The night stretched on, long and starless. Rael Stormclaw, the Alpha King who had mastered armies and tamed rebellions, found he could not master the memory of a walk. He did not sleep. He stared into the darkness, haunted by the echo of retreating footsteps and the chilling, dawning realization that in casting her out, he might have shattered his own peace. Chapter 3, Exile by Choice. The first gray light of dawn found Rael still seated on the edge of his bed, a statue carved from tension and sleepless night. The phantom scent had finally faded from his chambers, chased away by the cool, sterile air coming through the open balcony arch. But the hollowness remained, a new and unwelcome organ where his certainty had been. He dressed with mechanical precision, each piece of his attire, the leathers, the weapons, the sigil of Stormclaw, a deliberate reassertion of the role he had played so perfectly the day before. He would go to the training grounds. He would spar until his muscles burned and his mind was blank. He would reclaim the narrative through sheer, physical dominance. Down in the citadel, the whispers had crystallized into stories. The tale of Liora Ashwyn's unbroken exit was already being polished into legend in some quarters, a cautionary fable in others. But one fact was concrete, passed from the gate sentinels to the stewards to the kitchen maids, she was gone. Not to the Omega quarters to mourn. Not to the elders to plead her case. She had walked straight through the main gates at first light, carrying a single, modest pack. When the sentinel on duty, a young wolf named Fenris, had moved to stop her with a stammered, "My lady, the king's orders," she had merely looked at him. Not with anger, not with pleading, but with a quiet finality that had dried the words in his throat. "I am complying with the king's rejection," she had said, her voice clear in the crisp morning air. "I am no one's lady." And she had walked into the mist-shrouded forest of the outer territory, the land that bordered the wilds, where the pack's influence thinned and solitude began. She chose exile before it could be decreed. She claimed obscurity before it could be forced upon her as a punishment. The outer territory was not kind. It was a place of gnarled trees, rocky outcrops, and swift, cold streams. The hunting cabins here were crude, used only seasonally by patrols. Lyra found one such structure, its door hanging from one leather hinge, its hearth cold and filled with old ash. She did not weep as she pushed the door open. She did not curse Rael's name to the silent trees. The deep, shattering pain of the rejection, the severing of a bond she had felt the instant she'd stepped into the great hall, a bond she had quietly, secretly hoped for, had been metabolized in the long, walking hours of the night. It had been transformed into something else, a clean, sharp ache, and beneath that, a flicker of something hard and new. Humiliation required an audience. Here, there was none. Only the wind, the chattering of squirrels, and the watchful silence of the wilderness. The cruel whispers of the court, the pitying stares, the triumphant smirks, they could not reach her here. Their power died at the tree line. Her first days were pure survival. She repaired the door, gathered wood, cleared the hearth. Her hands, once accustomed to finer tasks, grew calloused and strong. She set simple snares, fetched water from the stream. The physical labor was a brutal blessing. It filled the hours, demanded focus, and in its exhausting simplicity, it began to sand away the lingering edges of the girl she had been, the chosen, displayed, and discarded mate. At night, by the weak fire, the silence pressed in. And in that silence, the dormant thing within her began to stir. It wasn't her wolf, not exactly. That connection felt muted, cautious, as shocked by the rejection as she was. This was something more fundamentally her. A core of self that had been buried under years of expectation, of waiting to be chosen, of preparing to be a consort. It had been pruned and shaped to fit a role that had now been violently vacated. Now, with no role to play, it began to grow wild. A confidence, not of birthright or bestowed status, but one tempered in the cold forge of pain. She thought of Rael's eyes, not with longing, but with a new, cold clarity. She saw the calculation in them, the performative strength. She saw the crack that had appeared in his armor when she hadn't played her part. The memory, which should have weakened her, now felt like a whetstone. One evening, a week into her exile, a large timber wolf, its coat ragged and its eyes bold with the hunger of a lone scavenger, prowled into the clearing before her cabin. It was a test. In the pack lands, her status, however ambiguous, would have offered some protection. Here, she was just prey. A week ago, fear would have frozen her. Now, a different instinct rose. She didn't cower. She stood slowly from where she knelt by the fire, meeting the wolf's yellow gaze. She didn't snarl, didn't pretend a dominance she didn't yet feel. She simply stood, rooted, her own stillness a territory marker. She let the sharp, clean ache of her survival, the new, unyielding core of her, rise to the surface. The wolf paced, sniffed the air. It didn't smell fear. It smelled jasmine and winter rain, yes, but now underpinned with the scent of cold stone and resolute earth. It smelled a quiet, gathering strength that offered no easy challenge. With a last, wary glance, it turned and melted back into the trees. Liora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled, but her heart beat a steady, powerful rhythm against her ribs. The distance from the court, from his crushing presence, was not a weakening. It was an unbinding. Every silent day, every night spent alone with her own thoughts, every small victory of survival, was a thread of the old life falling away. And what was being woven in its place was sturdier, quieter, and entirely her own. She was not waiting to be reclaimed. She was learning, for the first time, what it meant to be Liora. And in the deep solitude, that was becoming enough. More than enough. It was becoming power. Chapter 4, The Alpha King's Fracture. The confidence that grew in Liora's solitude became a phantom ache in Rael's bones. The citadel, once a perfect extension of his will, now felt like a poorly fitting skin. The silence of his chambers was no longer peace, it was an amplification of the echo her absence had left. His authority, once as seamless and unquestioned as the rising sun, began to show hairline cracks. It started in the war council. Kaelin, his most trusted beater, was detailing a minor border skirmish with a rogue clan from the eastern marshes. A straightforward tactical problem. But Rael's focus kept snagging on the map's edge, on the shaded area denoting the outer territory. His mind conjured an image of a crude cabin, of mist curling through pine trees. "Suggest we reinforce the sentry post at the Blackwater crossing," Kaelin finished, looking to his alpha for the final command. Rael blinked. "The crossing?" His voice was flat. He'd lost the thread. He saw the flicker of surprise in Kaelin's eyes, swiftly hidden. "Yes. Do it." The order was rote, devoid of the strategic nuance that was his trademark. Torin, his other beater, exchanged a silent, concerned glance with Kaelin. Later, in the training yard, his temper, legendary for its icy control, shattered. A young warrior, overeager to impress, landed a lucky blow that grazed Rael's shoulder during a sparring match. A week ago, Rael would have commended his initiative. Now, a wildfire of irrational fury roared through him. He disarmed the youth with a brutal economy of motion that was beyond sparring, pinning him to the hard-packed earth with a forearm at his throat. The boy's eyes widened in pure terror. The yard fell silent. It was Torin's calm hand on his bicep that pulled him back. "My king. He yields." Rael released the warrior, who scrambled back, gasping. The stark fear on the young wolf's face was a mirror, reflecting back not strength, but a tyranny of unchecked emotion. Shame, hot and acidic, burned through the anger. He walked away without a word, leaving a yard full of confused and wary stares in his wake. The reports began to trickle in. They were not even about her, not directly. They were patrol reports, hunting tallies, updates from the outlying sentries. But her name was a ghost in the margins. A scout, returning from the western edge of the outer territory. Game is plentiful near the old Pine Ridge. Saw the Ashwyn female at the stream. She didn't flee. Just nodded and went about filling her water skin. A sentry from the northern pass, making casual conversation over a meal in the guard hall, delivered the seasonal supplies to the border cabins. Left the usual bundle at the empty one by the silver birch grove. Came back later and it was gone. Place looked, lived in, tidy. A hunter, boasting in the tavern, took down a stag that would feed a dozen, right near the wild's edge. That Ashwyn woman had a clean snare line not 100 paces away. Rabbit every night, I'd wager. She's not starving. Each fragment was a needle. She didn't flee. Tidy. Not starving. They were facts devoid of judgment, yet they painted a picture of a life continuing. Of resilience. Of an existence that was not just sustained, but ordered, on her own terms. The most damning report came from Fenris, the gate sentinel, who was questioned by a curious elder. She walks, Fenris said, his voice hushed with a kind of reverence. Not like she's hiding. Walks with her head high, like she's listening to the trees. Saw a pair of young scouts from the Riverwind pack come across her path last week. They were being cocky, you know how they are. She spoke to them. Didn't raise her voice. Don't know what she said, but they stopped. Listened. Then they just nodded and went another way. Others listen when she speaks. The words detonated in Rael's chest. In his hall, before the might of the united packs, she had been silent until those 5 devastating words. Now, in the wilderness, she found her voice? And others heard it? He stalked the ramparts that night, the wind whipping his hair. The rejection had been a surgical strike meant to excise her from his narrative, from his destiny. He had believed that casting her out would diminish her, reduce her to a footnote, a lesson in his strength. He understood now, with a clarity that was both brutal and absolute, that he had been catastrophically wrong. Rejecting her had not erased her presence. It had done the opposite. It had carved her into him. Her calm acceptance was etched behind his eyelids. The scent of jasmine and winter rain was a permanent thread in his sensory memory. The image of her walking away, unbroken, was a mural painted on the inside of his skull. Every report of her quiet competence, her unasked-for dignity, was another chisel strike, deepening the groove. She was a ghost that grew more substantial with every passing day, while he, the solid, fearsome Alpha King, felt himself becoming the phantom, haunted, insubstantial, his authority leeching away with his sanity. He had meant to prove he had no weakness. Instead, he had identified it, publicly showcased it, and then sent it away to flourish in the one place where he could not control it, or the slow, maddening legend it was becoming. The fracture was no longer a hidden crack in his control. It was a canyon opening up beneath his feet, and he was falling, endlessly, into the space where she was supposed to be. Chapter 5, Eyes That Shouldn't Want Her. The canyon of Rael's obsession began to fill with the voices of others, and each one was a fresh torment. Liora's exile, intended as obscurity, had instead become a peculiar spotlight. The story of the Alpha King's rejected mate who did not break was a seed carried on the wind. It took root in curious minds. The outer territory, once ignored, became a destination for patrols that were a little too long, for hunts that strayed a little too far west. Rael first heard it in the war hall, a muttered aside between 2 visiting alphas from the Silvermen contingent, here to discuss trade routes. Heard she's living out near the Whisper Crags. My second saw her. Said there's a stillness about her now. Not like an Omega's submission. Something else. Intriguing. The word intriguing was a barb. It was not a word used for discarded things. Then, the gifts began to appear. Not for him, for her. A finely tanned rabbit pelt from a hunter who had a surplus. A basket of rare, sweet blackberries from the southern slopes, left anonymously on her repaired doorstep. A whetstone of superior quality, left where she would find it near the stream. They were small things. Courting gestures. The kind offered to a promising, unmated female of interest, not to a publicly shamed reject. Rael's spies, though he would never call them that, they were merely sentries with very specific reporting duties, brought him these details with careful neutrality. Each one was a coal placed on the raw nerve of his possession. She is not yours, his logic whispered. You cast her out. She is free. The words were true, and they had the structural integrity of ash. The detonation came on a gray, drizzling afternoon. A situation with a rogue bear threatening the northern herds demanded his personal assessment. The fastest route cut through the fringes of the outer territory. Rael took it, telling himself it was efficiency. His wolf, a tense and eager presence beneath his skin, knew it was a lie. He crested a wooded rise overlooking a wide, rocky clearing bisected by the swift stream. And there she was. Liora stood by the water, a woven basket at her feet, her hair damp from the mist. She looked, not just well, but vivid. The muted gray of her simple dress seemed to intensify the clarity of her eyes, the warmth of her skin. The fragile girl from the great hall was gone. In her place was a woman with a straight spine and a face composed of quiet purpose. And she was not alone. Kieran, the alpha heir of the strong and wealthy Howler Peak pack, stood opposite her, leaning casually against a birch tree. He was handsome, confident, his laughter echoing easily across the clearing. He held out a wrapped parcel, venison, by the look of it, prime cut. A courtship gift of substance. Rael froze, every muscle locking. He saw Liora's reaction. She didn't simper. She didn't blush. She looked at Kieran, then at the offering, and offered a small, polite smile that held neither encouragement nor dismissal. She said something he couldn't hear. Then she shook her head gently, turned, and picked up her basket of gathered herbs. A refusal. Clear and calm. But Kieran's expression didn't fall into dejection. It warmed with admiration. He said something else, his gaze lingering on her face with an open, appreciative interest that was a physical blow to Rael's gut. He wasn't looking at a rejected thing. He was looking at a prize. Rael's vision tunneled. The drizzle, the trees, the sound of the stream, all of it faded into a roaring white noise. All that existed was the scene below, another alpha, a rival, looking at her with want. A want Rael had publicly, viciously renounced. Jealousy, pure and primal, detonated inside his chest. It was a wildfire, a seismic rip that tore through the last vestiges of his rational control. His canines elongated, a low growl building in his throat that was entirely his wolf, a sound of pure, territorial fury. His claws dug into the bark of the tree he gripped, splintering the wood. She is free. The thought was a weak protest, drowned in the surge of possessive instinct. Mine. The correction was not a thought that it was a truth written in his marrow, screamed by every frantic pulse of his blood. It was a truth he had been a fool to deny. He watched as Liora gave Kieran a final, neutral nod and walked away, back toward the trees that sheltered her cabin. Kieran watched her go, his gaze thoughtful, intrigued, before he too turned and vanished in the opposite direction. The clearing was empty, but the image was seared into Rael's soul. He remained on the ridge, trembling not with cold, but with the violent effort to not shift, to not launch himself after Kieran and tear out his throat for the crime of looking, for the insult of wanting what was his. For proving, so blatantly, that Rael's rejection had not rendered her undesirable, but had instead made her uniquely, tantalizingly available. Other eyes were upon her. Eyes that saw worth where he had pretended to see none. Eyes that recognized the strength he had foolishly dismissed. The thought was unbearable. His rejection hadn't set her adrift in obscurity. It had set her afloat in a sea of new, dangerous possibilities. And as he stood there in the cold rain, the Alpha King understood a new, agonizing facet of his punishment. He had not gotten rid of his weakness. He had armed his rivals with it. And every glance they cast her way, every offered gift, was a twist of the knife she had calmly left in his chest the day she walked away. Chapter 6. A reunion of fire and silence. The trembling fury from the ridge took days to subside into a cold, gnawing dread. Rael's orders became sharper, his presence in the citadel a storm cloud that everyone avoided. He threw himself into punishing drills, dispatched the Howler Peak delegation with a terseness that bordered on insult, and stalked the halls like a caged beast. But the image of Kieran's admiring gaze, of Liora's quiet, unimpressed profile, would not leave him. Fate, it seemed, was not done with its cruel comedy. A sudden, early snowmelt swelled the river that fed the citadel's mill, causing a partial collapse of the old weir. The damage was in the borderlands between the central pack territory and the outer wilds, the very area where Liora's cabin sat upstream. Repair required the Alpha's oversight, it was a critical resource, and the engineers needed his authority to command laborers from several allied clans. He arrived on horseback, a contingent of builders and warriors at his back, his mood as grim as the slate-gray sky. The site was a mess of churning, muddy water and broken timber. And there, among the scattered workers from the outlying families, was Liora. She was not watching. She was working. Her sleeves were rolled up, her forearms mud-smeared as she helped clear smaller debris from the bank, her movements efficient and strong. The sight was so profoundly wrong it stole his breath. An Alpha's chosen, rejected or not, should not be laboring like a common drudge. Yet, she didn't look like a drudge. She looked capable. Rooted. A part of the land itself. His arrival sent a ripple through the workers. They stiffened, bowing their heads. Liora paused, a waterlogged branch in her hands. She looked up. Their eyes met across the chaotic space. Time did not slow. It crystallized. The roar of the water, the shouts of the men, the chill of the wind, all of it faded into a silent, vibrating hum. The last time they had stood in a shared space, the air had been thick with incense and judgment. Now it was thick with river mist and unsaid things. He saw the change in her immediately. It wasn't just the strength in her arms or the lack of fine clothes. It was in her eyes. The forest pool calm was still there, but the layer of hopeful light, the soft anticipation she'd carried into the great hall, was gone. Extinguished. In its place was a watchful, impenetrable stillness. She looked at him not as her alpha, not as her king, not as her destined mate. She looked at him as a circumstance. An obstacle, like the swollen river. That loss, the death of that hope, hit him with a physical force, harder and more devastating than any insult or defiance could have been. He dismounted, handing the reins to a beater without looking. He strode toward the water's edge, his gaze locked on her. The workers melted out of his path. "This is no place for you," he said, his voice cutting through the din. It was meant to be a command. It came out rough, strained. Liora lowered the branch to the pile. She wiped her hands on her thighs, a practical, unfeminine gesture. "The river threatens my home as well. My labor benefits the repair." Her tone was flat, informative. It held no deference, no challenge. It was the most neutral sound he had ever heard, and it scolded him. "Your presence is a distraction," he countered, the bitterness he'd nursed for weeks seeping into the words. He gestured vaguely at the men, some of whom were indeed stealing glances. "I will not have the work hampered." A faint, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. "Then perhaps you should not have come, my king. Your presence is rather more notable than mine." The title on her lips was not respect. It was a weapon, a icy formal distance. The air between them crackled, not with the electricity of attraction, but with the static of a severed connection, raw and live. He took a step closer, the unspoken desire of fire in his veins, warring with the bitter knowledge that he had put this wall between them. He could smell her, the jasmine and winter rain now layered with clean sweat, river water, and cold earth. It was a scent of resilience, and it called to his wolf with a maddening, possessive ache. "You refuse the comforts offered by others, yet you choose to grub in the mud," he said, the ghost of Cain's offered venison haunting the words. For the first time, a flicker of something sharp crossed her face. Not hurt. Amusement, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "I refuse obligations. I choose tasks. There is a difference. One you might understand, given your celebrated choice at the choosing." The direct hit landed perfectly. The reminder of his own performative rejection, now his endless private torment, left him speechless, furious. The desire burned hotter, fused with his frustration. He wanted to shake her, to kiss the cold calm from her lips, to demand she look at him with that lost hope again. He wanted to erase the last month and the terrible, unraveling consequence of his pride. But she had already turned away, picking up another piece of driftwood. The dismissal was absolute. Their reunion was over, no grand audience, no dramatic speeches. Just a few sharp, restrained sentences in the mud, and her silent, resolute back. The message was clearer than any shout. The story was no longer about his rejection of her. It was about her survival despite it. And in the economy of that survival, he had become irrelevant. He stood there, the Alpha King amidst the bustle of his own command, feeling more powerless than he ever had on any battlefield. The fire of his desire had nowhere to go, met only by her impregnable silence. And the emptiness where her hope for him had once lived echoed louder than the raging river. Chapter 7. Power Shifts in the Shadows. Rael left the riverbank not with the satisfaction of command, but with the taste of ashes in his mouth. The encounter was a wound that festered as he returned to the sterile order of the citadel. His throne room, once a testament to his unassailable strength, now felt like a gilded cage. The high-backed chair of antler and stone seemed to mock him, a symbol of a power that was leeching away, not through battle or rebellion, but through the quiet, steady current of a single woman's absence. In the outer territory, the change was subtler, but deeper. It began with the animals. The wary timber wolf that had tested Liora weeks ago now returned, not to challenge, but to linger at the edge of her clearing. It would lie in a patch of sun, one eye open, a silent, shaggy sentinel. Birds, usually skittish, would alight on the low-hanging branch near her window as she worked. It wasn't a Disney-esque chorus, it was a quiet acknowledgement, a settling of the natural world around her presence as if she were a fixed, benign feature of the landscape. Then, it was the plants. The herb garden she'd coaxed from the rocky soil behind the cabin didn't just survive, it thrived with an unnatural vigor. Her winter jasmine, a spindly cutting she'd found half dead, wound itself around her door frame and burst into clusters of star-like blooms that perfumed the air day and night, their scent richer, more intoxicating than any ordinary flower. It was a scent that carried on the wind, a quiet beacon. People felt it next. A hunter with a twisted ankle stumbled upon her cabin. She offered water, a poultice of crushed herbs. The relief was so swift, so complete, he stood in stunned silence before bowing his head, not to a queen, but in wordless gratitude. A young mother from a distant homestead, her child feverish and her hope dwindling, was drawn to the cabin by an instinct she couldn't name. Lyra's cool hands on the child's brow, her murmured words, seemed to pull the heat from his skin. The fever broke by morning. Word traveled, not in the shouted gossip of the court, but in the hushed, reverent tones used for things not fully understood. The stories that trickled back to the citadel were no longer about her dignity or her survival skills. They were different. "She has a touch that heals," the hunter told his wide-eyed family. "The land listens to her," the young mother whispered to her sister. "There's a light around her in the dusk," a patrolling sentry reported, his voice uncertain. "Not a glow. A stillness that gathers the light." In the dim, smoke-filled chambers of the Elder Council, the whispers took on a darker, more speculative tone. "The power does not lie in the throne, but in the blood," murmured Elder Theon, his gnarled fingers tracing the grain of the ancient table. "The Stormclaw line is strong in force of will. But the Ashwyn line, it was always said their strength was of a different nature. Deep earth, not cracking sky. We thought it dormant. Extinct." "The moon does not choose blindly," replied Liora, the eldest seer, her milky eyes seeming to see beyond the stone walls. "Perhaps the rejection did not negate the choice. Perhaps it activated it. The seed does not sprout until it is buried." "Are you suggesting fate chose true, and the king erred?" another elder hissed, aghast. Ilara's silence was more damning than any confirmation. The whispers reached Rael in fragments, each one a stone dropped into the dark well of his dread. Healing touch. The land listens. Ashwyn power. They painted a picture that dismantled his entire justification. He had rejected her as a potential weakness, as a distraction from his rule of pure, masculine dominance. Now, a terrifying truth was dawning: she was never weak. The quiet girl in the great hall hadn't been cowed by his presence. She had been waiting. Containing. The power he sensed as a subtle, intriguing scent was now unfurling, not in aggression, but in a profound, quiet authority that drew life to it. It was a power that nurtured and protected, a power that commanded respect not through fear, but through an undeniable, gentle gravity. He stood on his balcony one night, looking toward the dark line of the outer forest. The wind shifted, and for a moment, he caught it, the intensified, magical scent of night-blooming jasmine, now carrying the deep, resonant note of fertile earth and thriving green things. It was the scent of power blooming in solitude. His power, the kind that ruled through edict and enforcement, suddenly felt crude. Loud. Brittle. His throne, the solid granite seat of his ancestors, felt less solid with every passing day. It was just a chair. The real power, the deep, ancient magic of the land and the moon's true intent, was taking root in a cabin in the woods, watered by his rejection and her resilient spirit. The most devastating realization was this: in trying to prove he was strong enough to refuse fate, he might have proven himself unworthy of it. And in doing so, he had not shielded his kingdom from a weakness. He had exiled its greatest, most hidden strength. And it was growing, every day, further from his reach, making a throne of pine needles and river stones that commanded a loyalty his obsidian one no longer could. Chapter 8. The Alpha begs without words. The jasmine-scented wind became Rael's personal torment. It wove through the citadel's high windows, a fragrant ghost that mocked his stone and iron authority. The elder's whispers were no longer just rumors, they were a verdict, echoing in the hollows of his pride. Ashwyn power. Fate's true choice. The words were a cold chisel, methodically splitting the foundation of his identity. His control, once a fortress, was now rubble. The carefully maintained mask of the Alpha King shattered, not in a single explosion, but in a series of silent, desperate fractures. He stopped giving orders from the throne. He began to haunt the edges of his own territory. Disguised in a worn hunter's cloak, shadows clinging to him like a second skin, he would slip past the sentries after nightfall. His destination was always the same, the tree line overlooking the silver birch grove and the cabin that sat within it. He became a phantom spectator to the life he had thrown away. He watched her mend a fishing net by lantern light, her fingers moving with a patient grace that tightened his throat. He saw the timber wolf, now a regular fixture, rise and pad to her side as she sat on the stoop at dusk, accepting an absent-minded scratch behind its ears. He witnessed the quiet stream of visitors, not suitors now, but seekers. A farmer with a blighted crop left with a pouch of seeds and a lifted head. An anxious beater from a neighboring pack, drawn by the whispers of wisdom, spoke with her for an hour and left looking settled, his burden shared. She was becoming a node of soft power, a queen of the wild things and the troubled hearts. And she did it all without a single glance toward the citadel spires piercing the sky in the distance. His attempts to reassert dominance, to provoke some reaction, any reaction, that belonged to the old dynamic, failed spectacularly. He had a contingent of warriors patrol conspicuously near her clearing, their armor gleaming, their presence meant to intimidate. She merely offered them water from her stream, her expression one of mild curiosity, as if they were exotic birds. They drank, shuffling and abashed, and left without a word. He issued a formal, thinly veiled decree about unauthorized settlements on the royal hunting grounds. The next day, a neat bundle of prime pelts and a portion of dried, medicinal herbs were left at the citadel's postern gate, payment in kind, and a silent, devastating lesson in independence. It was an audit, settled in full. Each move he made, each heavy-handed attempt to reclaim his role as the center of her universe, only highlighted how thoroughly he had vacated that position. She no longer sought his approval, feared his anger, or desired his favor. His power over her had existed only in her willingness to grant it, and she had revoked that grant the moment she walked away. The imbalance was total. It wasn't political. It was spiritual. It was a starvation of the soul. The desperation that grew in him was not for the restoration of his authority. That was a lost cause, and some buried, honest part of him knew it. The desperation was a raw, animal thing, older than crowns and ceremonies. It was for the scent of her skin. For the sound of her voice speaking his name without ice. For the forgiveness in her eyes that would absolve him of this relentless, aching void. It drove him closer, eroding all caution. One moonless night, drawn by a compulsion he could no longer resist, he left the shelter of the trees. He moved like a ghost across the clearing, stopping just outside the halo of soft light from her cabin window. He could see her silhouette moving inside. The wolf by the step lifted its head, sniffed the air, and recognized him. It did not growl. It watched, its yellow eyes knowing, as if witnessing an inevitable conclusion. Rael stood there in the dark, the mighty Alpha King, brought to his knees not by an enemy, but by his own catastrophic error. He didn't call out. He didn't demand entry. He simply stood, a monument to his own ruin, and let the ache consume him. He was a king with no kingdom that mattered, a wolf with no pack that felt like home, a man begging without words for a mercy he knew he did not deserve. His silent vigil was his first true prayer. And it was aimed at the woman whose strength he had mistaken for weakness, whose forgiveness he needed more than breath, and whose distant, untouchable light had become the only thing his fractured soul could see. Chapter 9, The Choice He Never Had. The moonless night stretched, a velvet silence pressing down on the clearing. Rael did not know how long he stood there, a statue of longing etched in shadow. The chill seeped through his cloak, but the cold inside him was deeper, older. The wolf on the step eventually laid its head back on its paws, but its eyes remained open, fixed on him. A silent witness. Then, the cabin door opened. It wasn't a dramatic swing, just a quiet inward pull. Liora stood framed in the warm, golden light from within, her shape a silhouette against the hearth's glow. She wore a simple shift, her ash-brown hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't look surprised. She looked as if she had been expecting him, not tonight, perhaps, but eventually. As one expects the turn of a season. Are you going to stand out there all night, or have you come to deliver another decree? Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the stillness. The old, icy formality was gone. In its place was a weariness, a flat resignation that was somehow worse. It was the final push that broke the dam. He moved then, not with the predatory grace of an alpha, but with the heavy, stumbling steps of a man exhausted by his own war. He crossed the last few paces into the edge of the light. The fire's glow caught the hollows of his cheeks, the stark desperation in his storm-gray eyes, now stripped of all their royal arrogance. No decree, he said, and his voice was a raw scrape, unrecognizable. No command. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her forest pool eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin, to drown in the intensified scent of jasmine and deep, living earth. It was a scent of power now, quiet and immense, and it made his knees weak. I was afraid. The confession tore from him, ugly and bare. It hung between them, a truth so simple it dismantled the entire edifice of his pride. In the great hall, I felt the pull. The bond. It was absolute. Terrifying. His gaze was locked on hers, begging her to understand. I thought it was a trap. A weakness disguised as destiny. I thought to master it, I had to deny it. To prove I was stronger than fate itself. He took a shuddering breath, his hands clenching at his sides, claws digging into his own palms. I was a fool. The strongest thing in that hall wasn't my will. It was your calm. Your acceptance didn't prove my strength. It revealed my cowardice. Liora listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't look away. Her expression was unreadable, a placid surface over unfathomable depths. The hope he had killed was not rekindled in her eyes. That loss was a physical pain in his chest. My desire. He continued, the words coming in a tormented rush now, it didn't vanish. It festered. It became a sickness. I see other men look at you, and I want to burn the world. I smell your scent on the wind, and it's a hook in my soul. I dream of your touch, and I wake up empty. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I am not here as your king, Liora. I am here as a man, broken by the absence of the woman he was too proud to claim. The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the crackle of the fire behind her and the ragged pull of his own breath. Liora looked at him, this shattered giant confessing his ruin at her doorstep. She felt no thrill of victory. Only a deep, resonating sadness, and a weary understanding. Rael, she said, and his name on her lips, devoid of title, was both a gift and a curse. That girl in the great hall, the one who accepted your rejection, she died the moment she walked out those doors. She had to. What you see before you is what grew from the ashes. She wrapped her arms around herself, not in weakness, but in a gesture of holding her own center. Acceptance once cost me everything. My future. My place. My heart. But in losing it all, I found something else. Myself. My freedom. This, she gestured to the cabin, the clearing, the silent, watching wild, this is mine. And unbreakable. She finally let her gaze fully meet his, and the clarity in it was like a lance of moonlight. You speak of fear, of desire, of regret. I believe you. But your confession does not undo the cut. It does not replant the hope you uprooted. The scar is part of me now. Rael felt her words like a sentence. The raw honesty he had offered had not been a key, but a mirror, showing him the permanent damage. Is there? His voice broke. Is there nothing left of what could have been? Can a scar, can it be a foundation? Liora was silent for a long time, looking past him into the dark woods, as if consulting the spirit of the resilient life she had built. I don't know, she said finally, the truth a gentle, devastating blow. Love that is born from pain, reborn from ashes, is it stronger? Or is it just a ghost, haunted by the memory of the fire that created it? She looked back at him, her eyes holding a universe of hard-won peace and quiet sorrow. You asked for a choice now. But you never gave me one. Not then. So I will take my time with this one. The choice of whether the man you are in this clearing, stripped of your throne and your pride, is worth the risk of the scars he left behind. She took a step back, towards the warmth and safety of her cabin. The king rejected me. The man will have to wait. She closed the door softly. The latch clicked into place, a sound of finality that was not a slam, but a boundary drawn. Rael was left alone in the cooling dark, the scent of jasmine and forgiveness just out of reach. He had laid his soul bare and received not absolution, but a truth more formidable than any enemy, her freedom. And the terrifying, hollow realization that the choice he had stolen from her was now the only thing he would ever truly want. Chapter 10, The Crown That Bowed. Rael did not return to the citadel that night. He remained in the clearing, a solitary figure rooted in the cold dirt, until the first gray strands of dawn unpicked the seam of the sky. The wolf had eventually padded into the woods, leaving him to his vigil. The click of the latch had been a door closing on an epoch of his life. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of a single, reverberating truth. He had gone to her with raw honesty, the last currency he possessed, and she had not traded in it. She had simply acknowledged its value and left him holding it, useless. Her power was no longer latent, no longer simply intriguing. It was complete. It was the power of a life made whole without him. He walked back as the sun rose, not as a king returning to his fortress, but as a pilgrim leaving a shrine. The sentries at the citadel gates saw the change in him immediately. The furious, fractured energy was gone. In its place was a profound stillness, a weariness that went to the bone. They bowed, not out of fear, but out of a confused instinct. He did not acknowledge them. He went not to the throne room, but to the highest point of the fortress, a windswept observation tower used by lookouts. From here, he could see the vast sprawl of his kingdom, the bustling village, the training yards, the distant borders, and beyond, the emerald haze of the outer territory where a single thread of smoke now rose from a cabin chimney. The crown on his head, the antland iron circlet that was both weapon and symbol, felt alien. A lie given form. He reached up, his fingers closing around the cold metal, and pulled it off. He looked at it, this object that had defined him, that he had believed was the source of his strength. He had thought rejecting Liora would burnish its authority. Instead, it had revealed it as a cheap glamour. True strength was not in the refusal of a bond, but in the courage to honor it. Not in the denial of weakness, but in the humble ownership of it. He, Rael Stormclaw, was weak. He was weak with longing. He was weak with regret. He was weak with a love he had been too arrogant to recognize until it had transformed into something beyond his grasp. The crown had not protected him from that. It had blinded him to it. In the final, quiet reckoning of his own soul, he understood. Rejection did not make a king strong. It made him a coward hiding in a fortress of his own design. Owning his weakness, the desperate, howling need for her forgiveness, for her presence, for her, that was the first true act of strength he had performed since the choosing. Below, the kingdom stirred. Disputes would need settling. Patrols would need ordering. Alliances would need tending. The machinery of power waited. He would attend to it. But it was no longer the core of him. The core was a hollowed-out space, shaped exactly like Liora Ashwyn, and it ached with a clarity that was more real than any crown. He did not know if she would ever choose him. The scars he had given her were deep, and the freedom she had forged was precious. He might spend the rest of his days as a king ruling from a lonely tower, watching her smoke signal in the distance, a permanent reminder of his catastrophic lesson. Or, by some miracle he did not deserve, she might one day open her door and her heart again. But as the sun climbed, washing the land in gold, one truth was etched in stone, in the air, in the very rhythm of his blood. Liora was no longer the rejected one. She was the sanctuary. She was the lesson. She was the quiet, thriving power he had foolishly cast out and could now only yearn for, plead to, and respect. The Alpha King bowed his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. The crown rested on the stone parapet beside him, a relic of the man he used to be. The wind, carrying the faintest whisper of jasmine from the west, tousled his hair. He closed his eyes and faced it. She was the power he could never command again. And in finally understanding that, he had learned what it meant to truly reign.